It's the internet. You're busy. Let's do this. I'm Jeff Grubb. This is Grubbsnax. I'm going to start with this, that new studio, That's No Moon Entertainment, which is a name. This is a new studio that's getting off the ground. It is started by some former Call of Duty developers and former Naughty Dog developers, and the CEO is Michael Mumbauer, who was the former head of the PlayStation Visual Arts Group. The Visual Arts Group is the one that was in the news recently because there was some issues with the Visual Arts Group maybe going to make its own thing, and then they were going to work on the remake of The Last of Us. I think that was right. And then Naughty Dog took that over. Basically, a lot of the people from that space and from other places inside Sony and other places inside of Activision, they're getting a lot of money from Smilegate, which is the creators of Crossfire, which Crossfire, a name you might know now because of that Crossfire X that's coming exclusively to Xbox, and Remedy's working on it. Crossfire, one of the biggest games in the world. It is basically a Counter-Strike game in China that was at one point, in many years ago, making $1 billion per year in revenue. One of the biggest games in the world. So they have a lot of money. Looks like they are giving $100 million to this 100-person studio getting off the ground and letting them go ahead and start making a big game. We'll see what that turns into. But there's a couple things I wanted to talk about in relation to this story specifically. The first part is that I'm not surprised that like a new studio is getting this kind of money, even if it is unprecedented. We haven't really seen new studios raise $100 million from one source like this. Not that usually it takes a little bit more time to make something like that happen. But it goes back to where we are in terms of the availability of capital, which is really cheap right now. A lot of people are loaning out money. Interest rates are very low. So you might as well, like, even if you're a company that has like a lot of money, like Smilegate, you might want to just go out and borrow even more money and make stuff like this happen. Now, I don't know if they did borrow money, but if they did, if they wanted to, if they needed to, after this, for any reason, that capital's still very cheap. There's reasons to go out and just keep making and borrowing a lot of money, because right now is a good time to do that. And then also, we know that content continues to be very valuable. A lot of big publishers looking for as much content as possible. If what you have to do, if you can't go out there and buy one of these studios, which maybe Smilegate's not going to be able to compete with Tencent on that, you go out there and you talk to the people who are the creative forces at these companies and say, hey, what can we do to help you get set up on your own? And that's going to be a viable alternative to the acquisition frenzy that we've seen. And it's really, this is one and the same. It's all just kind of the same thing with a slightly different pathway. I just want to say one other thing about the PlayStation. They just had they announced the beta software today, and you could put an M2 SSD, NVMe, PCIe 4. Basically, you can put in a new SSD that is capable of expanding the storage on your PlayStation 5 if you get this beta software. And it seems like a little bit of a mess. I would just say wait a little bit. I mean, it's the beta software. Once we get the finalized software, by then, dummies like me will have tried to put a bunch of different SSDs in there and see what works, see what doesn't. The one big concern that a lot of people seem to have is the heat issue. Sony did warn you're going to want a heat sink to dissipate the heat that is coming off of the SSD. Otherwise, it will run dangerously hot. A lot of SSDs do come with heat sinks. Heat sinks are also easy to get. I would check out Newegg. I bet you could go on there and just order a pretty cheap SSD heat sink. Once again, if you want to ask a question, hit that ask a question button there at the top. If you're watching this later, giantbomb.com/chat, Thursdays at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. I'm not gonna change my time zone for you all. You figure it out. All right. From Octavius. Have you ever had a source give you wrong info, either on purpose or not? If so, how did that impact your relationship going forward? So this stuff does happen. I can't think of any instances where someone did it on purpose. So I don't think at least if someone's tried to like flush out like who my sources are by doing deliberate, wrong information, which is something I do consider as a possibility. I'm not aware that that's ever happened, and it's never worked as far as I know. From Angel 10701, with the Activision Blizzard lawsuit going on right now, how does it compare to the Riot and Ubisoft situations? And will we see more action done this time around or not? So the big difference is that the state of California is bringing this civil action against Blizzard. That's the big difference. In the riot situation, there was a lot of reporting, and then there was some like individuals taking action, working towards a class action, but it wasn't like backed by the state of California, and they didn't have the basically what would be the power of the law, the power of the state law behind them to enact difference. And I don't want to get, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the exact nuances here, but my big thing would be like the standing. Like, standing is, what did you stand to lose, or what did you stand to get hurt by if this company did you wrong? And obviously, when an individual at Riot was working there and they were being treated wrongly in the United States, at least, you would have a case there. But when the state of California comes against you, they don't have to worry about like any individual standing. They could just say these are civil rights violations, and we could just go after you for that specifically, and try to force you to change and set an example, and let the rest of the industry know that like we are out here being watchdogs, and we can treat you like an example and get away with that. There's a lawyer for an individual isn't going to worry about setting an example. They're going to worry about doing what's best for their client. And when a state agency comes after you, they are thinking much bigger picture. And that's why I think you got a little bit of that reaction from Activision Blizzard early on, where they're like, hell no, we're not going to admit any wrongdoing here. We're going lawyers first. We're not putting the PR face forward. We're putting the lawyer face forward. And that was a deliberate decision, I think, where they were like, this could be like a big fine that we could be dealing with here. A big fine, and like other sort of punishments that involve, maybe having someone from the state dictating there has to be some other person on our board that we don't want there. Like, that's the sort of thing that they could be concerned about here. And that has a lot more power, I think, than these other individual civil suits that were coming against these other companies. Now, I think, I got asked this on Twitter, I think, and it was saying, hey, could you talk about this on Grubbsnax? So I will bring this up here. There is now a lot of talk about unionization and collective bargaining and the collective power of workers, and what effect would that have on the industry? I think that would be, in this instance, if it does come from Activision Blizzard, if they do decide to organize officially, that would have a really big effect in terms of deciding like the scales of power and how they are distributed within the industry of making games. For so long, companies they know that there is a line of people outside the door waiting to get into this industry, and they can exploit that, and they have, and they will, and they continue to do so. If you put a union in place and you force collective bargaining on these companies and say, hey, yeah, sure, you could try to exploit these people, but we're actually going to step in and say, they can come work here, but we're going to make sure that you treat them with a certain baseline level of fairness and equality. That is something that could truly turn the industry on its head. And other companies would be like, hey, if it isn't going to be an industry-wide, like sort of every game developer in the country is going to be part of the union, other companies are going to raise the way that they treat employees, so they don't risk actually having a union. This is something I used to work at FedEx, and FedEx didn't have a union, but UPS did have a union, and FedEx would make it very clear, like they would had a scheduled payment increases. They had really good health insurance. They tried to have all these extra benefits so that people wouldn't feel as bad because they didn't have a union. Because they're like, hey, no, we're already treating you well. Please don't try to organize. Now, people are probably still going to try to organize in some of these developers in some cases, but having one union in the space can have a sort of, and I hate this metaphor because it's Ronald Reagan, but lift all boats, rising tide lifts all boats. That's usually not the case. But in this situation, I think it would have that effect. From C4 Pen, does the chip shortage increase or decrease the time to console revisions? Like a pro or a smaller version of the PS5, or no effect? I think in the specific case of consoles, I think it increased, or I think it decreased. I think it shortens the time before we see revisions, because if AMD and TSMC come out with chips that are even smaller, and you can get a larger yield per wafer, And I'll just explain that real quick. Chips, the systems on the chips that these consoles use are printed onto giant circular pancake wafers, essentially. And then they take a pizza cutter like Nick Gage and they just cut out those chips. And there's a certain yield where a certain number of those are going to be failures and they aren't going to work. But if you can get a smaller process, which if you've ever heard the terms like 7 nanometer or 10 nanometer, things like that, if AMD and TSMC say, hey, Apple no longer has the exclusive rights to TSMC's 5 nanometer process or whatever, we can take this same design and put it on a 5 nanometer process and get even more chips on each wafer. These companies are going to jump at that. And that, even if it's the same exact architecture and same exact design, if they shrink it down, and again, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but this is my understanding. And if I'm wrong, please feel free to send in a question and correct me. But even if they use the same architecture, the same design, and they shrink it down and put it in 5 nanometer and get more chips per wafer, those chips will be more power efficient. And so that would enable them to shrink the console down. And then they could save money in a bunch of other areas as well. Use less materials. They can shrink the gigantic MFing heatsink inside of the PlayStation 5, for example. And I think that they would jump at that opportunity, especially if TSMC has made improvements to getting better yields on those things, even beyond just like, oh, it's the same exact percentage of yield, but since we have more chips per wafer, you're getting more chips per wafer. But no, we've actually improved our techniques and there's less failure overall. Like, they would definitely jump at it then. And I think they would take that opportunity to at least do a slim. Now, you mentioned specifically Pro models. I don't know if it's a shortened time to the Pro model, but I do think we will see a slim, at least for the PS5, maybe for the, I don't know how. Xbox seems pretty happy with their hardware. But maybe, at least in one of the instances, I think we will see a slim model relatively soon, like in the next, in 2 years, 2.5 years. Yeah. And I think that's a little bit quicker than we saw it last time. Oh yeah. And then are you going to get are you going to crank it on the play date? AJ Swan asks. Of course I am. I love to crank it. Yeah, this was Grubbsnax. Yeah, find me on Twitter. I'm at Jeff Grubb. You can find my writing over at gamesbeat.com. I am a GamesBeat writer. But yeah, I want to say thanks to Giant Bomb for letting me do this. This stuff has been a lot of fun. We're going to be doing it for a little bit longer. See you next time. Ow.